Well, thank you for attending this morning. Before I begin, I just want to thank the folks at the Buffalo Bill Historical Center for giving me such warm hospitality during 2 weeks of research here earlier in the month. I learned an awful lot from them and from my researchers in the McCracken Library while I was here, and I extend my gratitude to you. You made this a wonderful place for serious study. I want to begin with an introduction of a place that some of you might know. If you drive toward the University of Montana in Missoula and then head west toward the mountains along the route of the old Northern Pacific Railway, you'll pass along a long, steep canyon known as Hell Gate, which you see pictured here. Fur traders from Canada and the United States gave Hell Gate this name 2 centuries ago because they knew that by entering the canyon, there was a good chance that they would come under attack by Blackfoot Indians, which is to say, they were going to descend into hell. Indians on the other side of the mountains, Kootenai, Salish, Pend Oreille, had experienced such attacks for many years in the Hell Gate Pass and many others through the Rockies. Today, I want to argue that the Blackfoot defense of these passes had everything to do with their determination to dominate the region's trade in firearms. First, though, I'd like to begin where this research on the Blackfoot Indians and firearms fits into a larger book project of mine, the one that Warren mentioned earlier. My study of the Blackfoot is just one chapter in a continental study of Indians and firearms between 1640 and the end of the Plains Wars in the late 19th century. I came to this topic because I noticed an interesting and, I think, problematic trend in historical scholarship. Whereas historians writing before the 1960s assumed that firearms made a substantial difference in American Indian life almost from the very moment that Indians obtained them, from the 1960s on, historians began to assume just the opposite. From the 1960s on, historians argued that firearms were less effective weapons than bows and arrows, and that to the extent that Indians traded for guns, it was for the so-called psychological effect of the gun's noise and smoke. Now, this change in scholarship, I surmise, stems from 2 factors. One is sociological. Up until the 1960s, the historical profession was dominated by men, and most of those men had military experience, hunting experience, or both. Since the 1960s, the makeup of the historical profession has changed dramatically. For one, the profession has become much more balanced by gender. There's a much lower percentage of historians, including men, who have any military experience, and even fewer, I suspect, have ever hunted recreationally or even handled guns at all. Trust me on this. A second factor has to do with several generations of historians violating the profession's basic principle: don't assume anything. The fact of the matter is that neither earlier historians who assumed the importance of guns or later historians who downplayed the importance of guns ever went about asking the historical record, the documentary record, whether their assumptions were correct. They never posed the question to the sources. So my project is based on asking the question: why, when, and how did Indians adopt guns, and what effect did that decision have on their lives in terms of warfare, hunting, politics, and material culture? The Blackfoot then formed one of my 10 case studies, and their example, I think, highlights a number of themes that will cut across this book. Now, as I've been conducting my research, a fundamental argument has been emerging, and it is this. From the late 1700s until the late 1800s, firearms became increasingly central to Blackfoot life, thus leading the Blackfoot to conduct their warfare and diplomacy with the aim of directing guns to their people and away from their enemies. So put another way, the importance of guns to Blackfoot economy and warfare influenced Blackfoot politics. Likewise, Blackfoot politics solidified the importance of guns in Blackfoot life. So there's a reciprocal influence between politics and guns in Blackfoot life. And this argument, I think, revises historical scholarship in some fundamental respects. First, I submit that yes, firearms made the Blackfoot more formidable warriors and even hunters. Second, I'm challenging the widespread assumption in histories of the American West that the warfare of Indians generally, and of the Blackfoot in particular, was driven by innate, and this is the term often used, bloodthirst. And that's a euphemism for savagery. Or put in academic terms, many scholars have argued that Blackfoot warfare was driven by cultural considerations. Now, I don't for a moment underestimate the importance of warfare to Blackfoot culture, not for a moment. But I do contend that there was a political logic to much of Blackfoot warfare. To the extent that the Blackfoot were bloodthirsty, to use the language of white contemporaries, it was because that bloodthirst had a political purpose, not just a cultural one. Another basic argument I'm going to make in my case study of the Blackfoot is that flintlock muskets that the Blackfoot obtained were marvelous tools. Now, to be sure, these muskets, and I'll talk about their features later on, were undependable at long range, and often they broke. But these issues were minor compared to the advantages that firearms offered. The fact of the matter was that guns were devastating when used in short-range ambushes, which was the predominant mode of Indian warfare and hunting. Wounds from bullets were far more deadly than those from arrows, and bullets were less easily diverted than arrows when fired from the cover of woods or long grasses. Gun-wielding Indians like the Blackfoot tended to begin their attacks on their enemies by firing 1 or 2 volleys from cover in order to immobilize the enemy. Then they would rush upon the enemy with knives, clubs, and hatchets. What I'm saying here then is that guns were supplements, essential ones, to older weapons. They weren't replacements for those weapons, but they were essential supplements to them. To a lesser extent, the same principle applied to hunting. The Blackfoot, like all Indians, were grateful for firearms when it came to bear encounters. Any of you who have gone walking around the woods and encountered a bear might appreciate that basic point. I'll take a gun over a bow and arrow when encountering a bear. But some Blackfoot also preferred guns when it came to felling bison. Now, this preference wasn't universal. Let me emphasize this point. Some Blackfoot wanted to preserve their powder and shot for warfare, in which they relied more heavily on guns than they did in their hunting. In bison hunts, which usually involved several men attacking the herd at once, some Blackfoot liked to be able to identify which man's arrows had felled which man's bison so that they could claim the animal. You can't do that when you're hunting with guns. Yet, the historical record is clear. Increasing numbers of Blackfoot, particularly during the 19th century, hunted bison with guns. And that's a trend that you can see across the plains during this period. Now, before I launch into some of these points, let me introduce you to the Blackfoot. The Blackfoot were comprised of 3 core groups, all of them equestrian bison hunters, who ranged between the Saskatchewan River on the north and the Missouri River on the south. And the constituent groups of the Blackfoot were the Blackfoot proper, or Siksika, the Bloods, and the Pagans, or the Pikuni. All of these groups spoke the Blackfoot language, part of the broader Algonquian language family. There were also 2 other groups closely allied with the Blackfoot during my period of study. The Gros Ventres, another Algonquian language group, and the Sarsis, an Athapascan-speaking group that lived to the northwest of the Blackfoot. At their height, in the 1830s, the collective population of these Blackfoot groups was in the range of 45,000 people. And for Native American confederacies, this is a very, very large population, rivaled only by the Comanches and the Sioux during the same period. Now, the Blackfoot, like many other Indians across North America, first acquired their guns from other Indians, not from whites. This is a pattern that you see across America from the 17th century on. The Blackfoot began to obtain small numbers of smooth-bore flintlock muskets in the mid-1750s through the Crees and Assiniboines living to their east. Now, here's a map that gives you a sense of where these groups are. Ignore the dates, by the way. The dates are when we have the first record of these Indians acquiring horses. I want to give you a sense of where the Cree and the Assiniboine are relative to the Blackfeet. me see if I can get my cursor working here. Whoops. Can all of you see where the Blackfeet are up at the top of the map? It says 1740. Look to the northeast, you'll see the Cree. Look to the direct east, and you'll see the Assiniboine. These are the groups through which the Blackfoot first acquired their guns, powder, and shot. Now, the Crees and the Assiniboines were beaver trappers extraordinaire, and they acquired their catch to the French for firearms and other manufactured goods. Many of you who know the history of North America during this period know that the French penetrated far into the interior of North America well in advance of the English. Well, in turn, when the Crees and the Assiniboines acquired manufactured goods from the French, they then traded these goods, usually when they were pretty well used, to tribes further to their west, like the Blackfoot, in exchange for horses and furs from those groups. Well, French guns delivered by the Crees and the Assiniboines made an immediate difference in Blackfoot warfare. And here's our source for knowing that. In the 1780s, an adopted pagan named Sakamapi, by the way, when I say pagan, I don't mean non-Christian, that's the tribal name. An adopted pagan named Sakamapi told a fur trader visiting with his people that when he was a teenager, several decades earlier, his people went out in a war party against the Shoshones, often known as the Snakes, wielding 10 guns, 30 bullets, and several handfuls of gunpowder. Now, at this time, the Shoshones, who you see on this map, are located just to the west of the Rocky Mountains. They would begin to move east with the bison herds later on. The Shoshones had been pressing eastward against the Blackfoot for several years because of another revolutionary technology that they, too, had obtained indirectly through Indian hands from Europeans. And here I'm referring to the horse. The horse had been spreading northward from Indian horse raiders in New Mexico for several decades leading up to this point. And so the pagans and the Blackfoot more generally had been feeling the pressure from these mounted Shoshone in the years leading up to this military encounter. But on this day, the pagans had an answer to the Shoshone's big dogs, as the Blackfoot called the horse. In preparation for battle, the enemies lined up on either side of a field, as they were accustomed to do, anticipating that the fight would take place with bows and arrows and shields. But knowing that they had firearms in store, the pagans and their allies moved to within 60 yards of their Shoshone enemies. Then, when the Shoshones stood up to launch their arrows, the pagans leveled a volley of lead at them. The resulting deaths, and there were many according to Sakamapi, were simply unacceptable in Indian warfare. War parties, we often forget in Indian country, were made up of male relatives, fathers, sons, uncles, brothers, cousins, and the like. And none of these relatives was expendable. These weren't professional soldiers marching to the order of a social superior, but relatives and peers. And so, on this day, as their men began to fall, the Shoshones beat a quick retreat and then spread the news about their enemies' new weapons. As Sakamapi told the fur trader David Thompson, and I quote, "The terror of that battle and of our guns has prevented any more general battles," by which he means we didn't line up on in open fields anymore to fight with bows and arrows. And I continue. "And our wars have since been carried out by ambush and surprise of small camps, in which we, the Blackfoot, generally have the advantage, from the guns, arrow shods of iron, long knives, flat bayonets, and axes from the traders." End quote. By the 1780s, the Blackfoot had adopted horses too. Thus, when combined with the gun, transforming them into an expansionist power on the northern plains, much like the Comanches on the southern plains and the Sioux along the Missouri. The Blackfoot raids for horses, women, and war honors carried them from their base along the Saskatchewan River to the headwaters of the Missouri River and the passes of the Rocky Mountains, to the peril of many, many Indian groups in the neighborhood, like the Shoshones and the Crows. At the very same time, the Blackfoot were under pressure from their north and east from the Crees and Assiniboines, who had trapped out their own beaver populations and now sought out fresh stocks in Blackfoot territory. Yet the overall trajectory of the Blackfoot during this period is clear. They were ascendant. They were becoming more powerful. And I think their example forces us to acknowledge an important point. Indian history, contrary to the way many of our historical accounts chart it, was not simply one disaster after another. You don't have white contact and then Indian fortunes plummet. That's the case that's the case with some groups, but not with others. Some Indian groups, for a time, managed to turn the forces of colonialism to their advantage. And in this case, we're talking in the forces of colonialism aren't colonial populations, they're horses and guns. Now, in the midst of this intertribal competition, fur traders began to arrive in Blackfoot country, setting the stage for what I call a Blackfoot political economy of firearms, what I mentioned in my introductory remarks. Spearheading this expansion of the trade into Blackfoot country was the Hudsons Bay Company, whose traders first reached the Blackfoot in the 1780s, followed by the creation of permanent trade posts all along the Saskatchewan, anchored by Edmonton, which you see here. Looks a little different today. Soon, the HBC, as it's known for short, was rivaled by another Canadian firm, the Northwest Company, which was determined to beat the HBC in the race to the Western tribes. As long as these companies limited their trade to the Blackfoot country, this competition between the HBC and the Northwest Company was a bonanza for the Blackfoot. The ideal situation for Indians anywhere in North America was to have European rivals competing for their business. As you probably can surmise, that competition was the better for them to increase the price that Europeans paid for their furs and to lower the price that they paid for European manufactured goods. The problem for the Blackfoot, however, was that these traders were determined to extend their trade to Blackfoot enemies, who the Blackfoot had been dominating for years because of their monopolization of firearms. And here you see a map that charts the HBC posts. As many of you might know, the HBC and the Northwest Company later, because their competition was driving both of them into the ground, merged, much to their benefit. The Blackfoot opportunity to acquire firearms, coupled with the difficulty of their preventing their enemies from acquiring guns, grew more pronounced over the years as Spaniards, Frenchmen, and then Americans moved into Blackfoot country from their base in St. Louis beginning in the 1810s. What's more, these St. Louis traders were intent not only on supplying Blackfoot rivals with guns, but trapping beaver in Blackfoot country themselves, thus robbing the Blackfoot of the profits of their own territory. And of course, what I'm speaking of here are the mountain men of legend in the American West. Confronted by this dilemma, the Blackfoot adopted a strategy that they would follow for the better part of 50 years. They were happy to trade at Hudsons Bay Company and Northwest Company posts as long as the traders limited their exchanges to the Blackfoot and as long as the trade posts operated according to Blackfoot rules, by which I mean the trade posts offered the Blackfoot free blacksmithing services, which was essential to their use of firearms, and as long as the trade post provided Blackfoot customers with free gifts of powder and shot. When the traders refused to abide by these rules, the Blackfoot attacked the trade posts and other indigenous customers, and sometimes the traders themselves. The Blackfoot also adopted a strategy of patrolling the mountain passes leading to their rivals, like Hell's Gate, ambushing anyone who dared to cross their paths. They killed and plundered mountain men, who they discovered setting traps in the streams of their country, sometimes taking the mountain men's furs and horses to trade to Hudsons Bay Company and Northwest Company posts on the Saskatchewan, often for firearms. It was in this context that Hell Gate acquired its name. To the victims of these attacks, both Americans, Canadians, and Native, the Blackfoot seemed to be everywhere. The Blackfoot were clear as day about the purposes of their militancy. For instance, In 1811, the commander of Edmonton Post wrote to his superiors in the Hudsons Bay Company that the pagans of the Blackfoot Confederacy promised, quote, "If they again meet with a white man going to supply their enemies, they would not only plunder and kill him, but that they would make dry meat of his body." Pemmican, in other words. This threat, the commander continued, they are sufficiently brutal to fulfill in its utmost extent, according to widespread opinion, end quote. 2 years later, the same commander wrote back to his superiors, quote, that the Blood Indians and the Blackfeet are determined to steal every horse belonging to white men, in revenge for the death of their relations, 50 of whom have been killed by the Flatheads since last summer. In other words, they're blaming the traders for the deaths inflicted upon them by the Flatheads. White men, they say, by supplying the Flatheads with firearms, are the principal cause of their great loss. Another 2 years later, he reported, by the way, he files a report every 2 years. Another 2 years later, he reported again, the Blackfeet Indians consider the Southward Indians our most intimate allies and always betray an inclination to make us participate in the vengeance intended for them. In consequence, our hunters, meaning white hunters, are afraid to go to the south side of the river, the Saskatchewan. That was the idea. That was the very idea. Put another way, there's a strategy to this warfare. It's not simple bloodlust. It's not just revenge. It's not savagery. There is a political strategy behind these attacks. The stakes in this contest became even greater in the 1830s as a succession of American firms, headed by the American Fur Trade Company of Pierre Chouteau, abandoned the strategy of having mountain men trap in Blackfoot country and instead began building posts all the way to the headwaters of the Missouri. These posts included Fort Union, Fort McKenzie, and, as many of you probably know, Fort Benton, which you see here. There were also a host of other short-lived stations. Aside from giving the Blackfoot unprecedented access to guns and other goods, these posts represented a new market for the Blackfoot. Whereas the Canadian firms traded only for beaver pelts, wolf furs, and small furs like muskrat, they also traded for pemmican, the American posts wanted bison hides. Because whereas the Canadian posts could only be supplied by difficult canoe routes and overland horse trains, the American posts on the Missouri River were supplied first by large keel boats and from the late 1830s on, steamboats. Thus, the American posts, unlike the Canadian ones, could afford the cost and the burden of transporting heavy buffalo robes downriver and plentiful amounts of trade goods upriver. And those trade goods were plentiful. In some of the research that I've done, I've counted 5,000 guns being shipped upriver in a 5-year span. This is a heavy, heavy load. It was in this context that the Blackfoot political economy of firearms, as I call it, reached its logical conclusions. And try to follow me here. The Blackfoot fed themselves, clothed themselves, housed themselves, and traded for European goods with the products of bison, buffalo robes, and pemmican. To defend and expand their hunting grounds, they needed firearms, particularly since so many of their enemies had them too. The job of processing bison robes for the trade belonged to women. Women were the ones who scraped the guts off the hides and prepared them for trade. Thus, the Blackfoot had a new incentive to enter into polygamous marriages. Whereas a first or second wife in these polygamous relationships typically came from within the group and held high status, other wives, third, fourth, fifth, even sixth, usually were captives from other tribes. Acquiring those captives from other tribes required guns. So in other words, to acquire the labor to process the buffalo for the trade for firearms required firearms. The Blackfoot also needed guns to go horse raiding, for they now required horses in warfare, hunting, and seasonal migrations. They gifted horses to each other when it came to proposing marriage, compensating for a crime, recruiting warriors for a raid, and a host of other social interactions. Giving horses as gifts was the basic social lubricant in Blackfoot society. Acquiring those horses from enemies required guns. So in short, in so many ways, the gun had become fundamental to Blackfoot life. To ensure the steady supply of firearms, powder, and shot, the Blackfoot permitted those American firms to set up their posts in Blackfoot country, thus giving the Blackfoot the option of trading either on the Missouri or on the Saskatchewan. They also continued to raid their Indian enemies and occasional mountain men, those who were left, both to stem the flow of guns to their rivals, but also to plunder furs and horses, which they traded at the posts for guns. The terrified victims of these attacks often denounced the Blackfoot as bloody savages. But as I hope you'll agree, clearly there was a practical logic to what the Blackfoot did. Now, in my remaining time here, I want to give you a sense of the kinds of guns for which the Blackfoot traded and the way that the guns entered Blackfoot material culture. Now, from the mid-18th to the mid-19th century, the basic Blackfoot firearm was a light flintlock musket known as a Northwest trade gun. It's usually identified through two features. One is the snake or serpent side plate, and the other is a stamp of a fox. And I think those images have a deep cultural significance for Indian people across North America, which I'll explain in a bit. Typically, these guns were between 31.5 and 48 inches in length, and from 56 to 58 caliber. Now, contrary to many people's assumptions, these guns were not throwaways. They were not the worst of what Europeans had to offer. Quite the contrary. These guns were light, to be sure, but not because Europeans could manufacture light guns cheap. Indians demanded light guns because they traveled hither and yon with them. And other features too, as I'll talk about in a bit, these guns met the demands of Indian customers. Only by the 1860s and 70s were the Blackfoot obtaining six-shooter pistols and breech-loading rifles that held multiple cartridges. Guns that were easy to use on horseback and that were accurate at very long range. Yet, by this period, when the Indians were obtaining these kinds of weapons, the Blackfoot political economy that I've sketched out for you was coming to a close, mostly because of the extermination of the bison, because of white Americans' militant spread into the plains and Rocky Mountain West, and the Blackfoot devastation by epidemic diseases like smallpox. There is this brief period of time in the 1860s and 70s in which Indians are basically outgunning the American military, at least when it comes to firearms, not in terms of artillery, of course, but their economy is collapsing with the destruction of the bison and their evisceration by epidemic disease. Now, one of the things I've been researching while I've been at the BBHC is the way that the Blackfoot and Indians more generally made these firearms their own. In other words, in the ways that they took cultural possession of these objects which they obtained from other people. Indians influenced, for instance, the appearance of these guns. Let's take, for instance, the serpent plate. These serpent side plates were not typical for guns acquired by whites, but Indians insisted upon it, and I think there's a good reason for it. In most Native American cultures, the shaman, or in the Algonquian language, the powwow, acquired his powers by having a vision, and usually a spirit would appear to him in the form of a snake. That snake spirit gave the shaman, or the powwow, the power to implant poisonous objects in the bodies of his enemies. Well, that's what a gun does. So in other words, the gun captures or crystallizes the power of the shaman. Likewise, if we go back to that fox stamp, the fox stamp first appears on 17th century guns. It's basically the seal of a particular gun manufacturer. Well, that gun manufacturer wasn't in business in the late 18th and the early 19th century, but Indians still wanted that stamp. I think any of you who know anything about Native American mythology know the special role of the fox as a trickster in those cultures. He's a wily fellow. He can outsmart his enemies. enemies. And so when you think about the serpent and the fox on one weapon, it gives the wielder of that tool tremendous, tremendous power. Something else I've been interested in is the ways that Native people manipulated their guns. Let me go back to here. So you see those tacks on the butt of the gun and along the barrel here. Those are ubiquitous in Native American guns. They get these guns and then they start to decorate them with the tacks. We're still not sure what the meaning of the patterns of these tacks are, if there was any meaning at all. But clearly it's a way of taking possession of the guns, individualizing them, making them meaningful. Likewise, Indians engaged in their own repairs. Too often in the scholarship, I read about how, well, these guns were prone to break and thus they would only be so useful to Native people. And what these scholars overlook is that Native people could figure out ways to make the guns useful even after they had minor imperfections. So, for instance, this Native person has made a repair by using leather to tighten up the gun when there was a break. Likewise, there are archaeological sites in the East dating from the late 17th century in which we find Native villages where one particular home had a cluster of hammer locks, trigger springs, and the like, and other objects that suggest someone in the village was making minor repairs on guns. So they figure out how to do this very quickly. There are multiple accounts of Indians straightening barrels when they were damaged, and the like. We know that Native people manufactured shot. To be sure, Native people bought bullets from the traders, but more often than not, they bought bar lead, heavy bars of lead, which was cheaper. And they would then take this lead back to their villages, melt it down, and cast it into bullets using the tools that you see right here. And these kinds of tools are ubiquitous in archaeological sites relating to Indian country. So they're decorating the guns, they're repairing the guns, they're manufacturing their own shot. What we also see is that by manufacturing their own bullets, Native people could respond to a basic problem of maintenance and repair when they were on the trail. One of the problems of using these muskets is that they could get clogged with powder and become inoperable after a certain number of uses. Well, the Indian answer to that was to move to smaller and smaller bullets as the barrel became more clogged until they had an opportunity to return back to their villages where they could clean the guns and return to the original caliber. Now, guns became important to the Blackfoot not only in terms of warfare and politics, but culture. And I think one of the most striking examples of this to me is how the Blackfoot ranked their war honors, popularly known as counting coup. The Blackfoot alone among the Northern Plains tribes considered capturing an enemy's firearm as the most prestigious act that a warrior could make. And they celebrated this accomplishment by depicting it on robes, teepees, clothing, and even horses. I want to show you some examples of this sort of thing. So what you have here is a montage of the various ways that the Blackfeet depicted their use of firearms. What you see here in the top left corner is an image of a Blackfoot man capturing a firearm from the teepee of one of his enemies. What you see over to the top right, obviously, is a number of Blackfoot men surrounded by their enemies, and they're defending themselves with firearms. Bottom left, it's pretty obvious, a Blackfoot man shooting down one of his fleeing enemies with a firearm. And I love the one that's number 11 there. A Blackfoot man on horseback killing a bear with a firearm. Don't try that at home with a bow and arrow. I'll give you some examples of how these images appear on shirts, teepees, horses, and the like. Blackfoot men, when they wanted to depict their war honors, would paint shirts that their wives had designed for them. And what you see here in the middle of this war shirt, and there's a close-up on the bottom, is a rifle in the middle. And that rifle, or rather that trade gun, illustrates that this man captured a gun from the enemy. You'll notice he also captured a number of bows from the enemy. In all likelihood, the human-like figures at the top represent men that this warrior had killed. I want to give you a couple other examples of these war shirts. As you can see, the man on the left is prominently displaying a firearm. So likewise, the man on the right who's shooting down one of his enemies, who's also dropping a gun, you might notice. This one I absolutely love. This guy has captured 3 different firearms, as you can see. 1, 2, 3 in the close-up. There's a standoff with guns on the upper right of the shirt. Now, Native people also illustrated their capture of enemy guns and their use of guns against the enemy in their painting of teepees, both inside and outside. This gives you a sense of what these teepees look like, but I want to show you some of the liners. So this would be for the interior of the teepees. Notice on the very bottom, you see those dots, that represents bullets flying. There you see men engaged in a gunfight. The upper left, there are men with firearms shooting some of their enemies. Pretty obvious here what's going on, especially inside the circle. There are bullets flying absolutely everywhere. By the way, these, as you can see, these are canvas teepee liners. These are painted by men on the various Blackfoot reservations in the early 20th century. They're remembering events from their childhood in the 1860s and 1870s. And here too, you'll notice in the middle, there are some men battling with firearms. Up at the top, or just above those men, you can see the various weapons that they captured from their enemies. Similar liner here. Robes that men wore, mostly on ceremonial occasions, also depicted their war honors. This is a famous painting by the artist Carl Bodmer. And you'll notice here towards the bottom, maybe the next to last row before the bottom, this man has captured a Northwest gun and several bows from his enemies. And here's another example of one of those robes. If you look at the bottom right corner, there's some great depictions of men with guns fighting someone who's trying to steal one of their horses. And then finally, and I love these, the painting of horses. I'm not sure how the horses feel about this, but you'll notice on the haunches of the horse, there are a number of Northwest guns painted here, illustrating that the owner of the horse had captured, this is quite a prominent man, 4 guns from the enemy. And here's a close-up. One last point on material culture. No question about it. Guns were central predominantly to men's life, but women participated in the material culture of guns as well. They're the ones who made the shirts that the men painted. And not the least of all, they made the gun cases that men used to carry their weapons into the field. Now, most of the examples we have date from the reservation period, but they suggest the material culture of the Blackfoot and other Plains Indians in the late 18th and early 19th century. Oh, by the way, here's a rock pictograph. This is terrific. I need to get more information on this one too. It's telling passersby something very, very important. But here's an example of a gun case in the Historical Center here's collections. Again, made and decorated by a woman. And a beautiful example right here. Sarcees being one of the affiliates of the Blackfoot Confederacy. So I want to conclude here with a final argument about the Blackfoot experience, and one that I think applies to the case of every single tribe that I'm studying in this larger book project on firearms. The Blackfoot did indeed become dependent on guns to fight their wars and hunt their game during the late 18th and the 19th centuries. And yet, this dependency on a technology did not translate into dependency on white governments. The fact of the matter was that colonial states, including the United States, were never able to control the flow of firearms into Indian country. There was simply too much competition for Indian customers. Even when one nation's traders dominated the market, something that never happened in Blackfoot country, the governments of colonial states never exercised the power to keep those traders from providing what Indian customers wanted. And the reason is that white traders and Indians were interdependent. Traders depended on Indians for furs, and, in some other contexts, like the late 17th century Southeast, slaves. Just like Indians depended on the traders for guns and other manufactured goods. That interdependency between Indian customers and the traders didn't end until the reservation period. Interdependency in the context of the trade was a basic feature of North American life for 3 centuries. And in that sense, the story of the Blackfoot and their guns is a story of America writ large. Thanks.